Okay. You ready? Let's do this. You're listening to Explore Magazine's Live the Adventure podcast. This is the podcast that delves deep into the outdoors, will inspire, inform, and get you stoked to explore. And I'm your host, David Webb. Welcome to the very first episode of Explore Magazine's Live the Adventure podcast. I'm David Webb, editor of Explore Magazine. With every episode, I'm going to lead a discussion on adventure, and the outdoors, on wilderness, and the issues that affect these things we love. So it's fitting today that we start with a discussion of the nature of adventure itself. What adventures are you planning this year? Maybe a week-long canoe trip? A weekend of camping? If you're my first guest, Frank Wolfe, you tend to think a little bigger. Frank Wolfe is one of Canada's most experienced adventurers. He's a regular contributor to Explore Magazine, as well as a blogger on our website. Plus, he's a public speaker and he even has a new book out. It's called Lines on a Map. The book is a chronicle of his grand expeditions over the past 2 decades or so. And believe me, they're grand. Frank's latest article appears in Explore Magazine's Spring 2019 issue. It details an incredible 1,800-kilometer long canoe trip he embarked on last summer. I caught up with Frank in Vancouver recently to chat about this article, his book, what he has learned from his epic travels, what you can learn from his epic travels, technology and technology addiction, and you know what? We also talked about toilet paper. So let's get going with part 1 of this special 2-part podcast with Frank Wolfe. Frank, what have you been up to these days?
Well, most recently, just doing some, talks and some writing on some of my recent journeys. This past summer, I did an 1,800-kilometer trip from Yellowknife, basically downtown, Old Town Yellowknife, and we journeyed across the Pikes Portage through a myriad of lakes and rivers to the headwaters of the Back River, or the Great Fish River, as it's originally called by the First Nations of the area, and took that all the way down to Chantery Inlet, the Arctic Ocean. And the Back River is basically probably the most remote river in mainland Nunavut, and lots of technical rapids, and amazing wildlife. And so that was the most recent journey, which people can read about upcoming.
Yes, if you're a subscriber or you pick it up on the newsstand, you'll know that story. But for a lot of the listeners, they're going to think, wait a minute, did he say 1,800 kilometers across the Barren Grounds? How did this come to be? What gave you the idea to do this?
Yeah, basically over the years, I've tried to do one big journey per year, and I often will plan it in remote areas, the most remote areas of North America, often other places as well. But there was kind of a bit of a blank space in the map. I've been trying to kind of bit by bit explore every kind of little remote section of Canada I possibly can, and I'd never done the Back River. It's been on my hit list for years and years. But also my philosophy in terms of journeying is I don't just take a bush plane drop to get me past the hard stuff. So I'll basically, minimal budget and just take regular airline up to Yellowknife, as my friend Ryan and I did, and then just make it work from there. The amazing thing about Canada and Canada's north is we have this kind of endless network of lakes and rivers that First Nations have been using for thousands of years. Before there were planes, that's how people got around. Before there were roads, that's how people got around. And I'm just kind of doing it the old school way. So kind of making our way up there, and kind of it's much more of a satisfactory trip when you get there under your own power. Than just getting kind of, flown over the easy stuff and kind of going downhill only. So, just kind of linking it all together, and every single lake and river, including the Back River, is an area that I'd never traveled to before. And my whole philosophy is also to never repeat myself in my journey. So this was a fresh journey, a fresh landscape, when you can go down a waterway that you've never seen before. It kind of really puts you in a really immediate state of mind, because everything's so new. It's not like getting up and doing your 9 to 5 every day in the city, which is kind of more of a comfortable kind of monotony. This way, it's kind of everything is fresh and new. You're challenged by working your way through this kind of wilderness landscape, and you never know what's going to be around the next corner.
Yeah.
And so that's why the back kind of really appealed to me. This kind of very northern line, kind of in the furthest northeast corner of mainland Nunavut.
For sure. That's really interesting. I mean, it's neat when you said you'd never want to repeat a trip and you're always looking for the new journey. So when you're looking at a map of northern Canada and you're seeing a start and an end, especially through just that wild open terrain terrain with all those waterways, all those lakes, all those rivers. I've been up there, not to the same extent you have, but I have been up there. And how did you plot that route? Was it a natural route or how did you figure that out?
Yeah, I mean the back river has definitely been done before, and even this route has been done before. As far as that whole link up all the way through, I think it's been done before, but just kind of looking at other people's routes, like the Pikes Portage is a pretty popular way to get into inland, basically at the very east end of Great Slave Lake. There's this famous Pikes Portage. It was a traditional route that the First Nations would have gone to get up past the Lockhart River, to get to the inland area for hunting, and then eventually they showed that to kind of trappers and kind of 1800s explorers. This gentleman's last name was Pike. I forget his first name, but that's how it came to be. And that kind of gets you to the Thelon River, to the back river, to these headwater sources. So we basically worked it that way. But to me, it was all very fresh and very new.
That's interesting. And now, so many people who listen to this and who read Explore, a week, 10 days maybe in Algonquin would be a big journey. And so you're doing something like this, but you're not doing it by yourself. You found someone to go with you. So I'd like to hear about your trip partner a little bit as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the one thing, I've been doing these things for over 20 years, and I've gone through a lot of different trip partners, and it is always challenging. Like my wife, she enjoys like the week-long Algonquin Temagami trips, which I love as well. But she doesn't want to be out there for months at a time, kind of, and I'd be probably not be good for our relationship. It's kind of a hard driving style of trip a little bit. So in this case, Ryan Bougie and I had never done a journey before, but he's very much I guess honed in the mountains, the coast mountains of BC. He was a ski patroller for 10 years, and he had that kind of,
How did you meet?
We kind of met actually years ago. We mountain biked together randomly with some friends in like Port Moody area, and we had we just hit it off, and we kind of kept in contact and kind of would bump into each other here and there. He came to a few of my film showings when I had some films at VIF. I had about some of my outdoor films. So, but just kind of I had a certain I just liked the guy, and I knew he had kind of this kind of flexible lifestyle where he did prioritize adventure as well. And so I was kind of coming down to it, and I just literally Christmas of last year, I didn't have a partner, and Ryan was walking with some friends close to where I live in Deep Cove, and we just kind of chatted for 5 minutes and didn't think much of it. Then about 2 days later I said, Ryan, he'd be a good partner. So I literally texted him one night, and he said, sure, I'm in. And I happened to, it's kind of like often serendipity, I happened to hit a time when him and his girlfriend were having a bit of a rough patch, and were temporarily separated, and so he was almost had this void in front of him. And
so it's important for him too, maybe to go up as well.
And he likes adventure, and he hadn't really been on a hard adventure for 5 years, so he was looking for an opportunity to do something, kind of getting out there again. He's done lots. He's actually skied the entire coast range of BC.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the story.
Yeah, so he's a very talented kind of outdoors person. Also a younger guy, like in the story I talk about his almost like addiction to technology.
Oh, yeah, we're going to cover that too.
Yeah, so and that's something I had never experienced with a partner before. Most of the time, partners are kind of, they kind of follow my lead a little bit. So, they don't there's no phones along. We'll have a little InReach messenger, which I just got introduced to only just a couple of years ago, as far as something to communicate with. I used to just go with literally a personal locator beacon and, tell people I'll see you in 45 days.
In case of emergency, basically.
There's no news is good news, right? So that's how I used to do it. But then Ryan definitely is more kind of brought up in that kind of tech generation where there's almost more of they can't live without technology, which is kind of like eye-opening, especially when you're trying to almost get away from it all.
Yeah,
my perspective.
You couldn't get away from it more, really.
Exactly. But I mean, a great guy, very comfortable in the wilderness. He could definitely push hard and stuff like that, but just in terms of, I never had anyone, I guess, instead of just quietly reading or listening to the river by your tent, he'd actually be watching like YouTube videos in the tent at night, which is like, I was like aghast.
It's funny. I know from a lot of your stories that you've written for Explore and for other places that you have different trip partners almost every time, and there's a wide variety. I mean, I know that the story you wrote was it with Pearson Ross?
That's right.
He was not very experienced at all in what you were doing.
Exactly,
kind of driving you crazy in that sense. And then you've got Ryan, who's got this different attitude as well.
Yeah.
And so what do you look for in a trip partner then? It's not necessarily experience. It's not necessarily skill, right? Like what is when you're thinking 30 days in the wilderness, what is the requirement?
I think oftentimes it's like I had like years ago, I'd done a journey like that. My first thing that got me into this in 1995, I did a canoe trip across Canada, and I did it with a guy I didn't really know that well, and we didn't actually get along that well. One of the stories in my book is about almost this. He was basically more or less a compulsive liar, but. Because I didn't know him, I didn't know he was, telling these tales about himself.
You don't know he's a liar until you realize he's a liar.
Time,
right?
Yeah. So in terms of if you tangent into a story, in terms of people you don't know and people you and the reason I kind of look for a certain thing in the partner is that this gentleman, he basically we got along, and the first time we met, it was in Oakville. He lived in a pretty wealthy neighborhood, and I opened the door, and he was like this 6'4", kind of square-jawed, basically like Fabio, looked like Fabio, the model kind of thing, and kind of the piercing blue eyes, kind of very, deep voice, and he said, let's go for a walk kind of thing. So all right, so we're going for a walk, and within about 10 minutes, he tells me this story. That when he was basically tree planting in northern Alberta in this area called Swan Hills, and he said it was, and this is of course pre-Google. I couldn't Google any facts that he told me.
It's harder to lie these days.
Took him on his word right back in '95, but he basically told me this story of how they're planting in Swan Hills, Alberta, and he used to plant with another person. There was this woman he described as this beautiful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman. Her name was Everest, and they basically would get a patch of land, and when you're tree planting, you basically kind of work back and forth, one end of land to the other towards each other. But Swan Hills is also known as the highest density of grizzly bears in Canada, according to Roman anyway. So they had actually a shotgun at each tree cache. When you go and fill up your trees again, you would get the shotgun in case a bear came onto your land, just as a precaution. So anyways, he used to plant with two dogs. He would describe one as a pit bull, one as like a half wolf. These two dogs that would plant with him, and so they started planting that day. And Everest is back in the days of the Walkman, so she had her Walkman on. She was hunched over, planting at one end, and Roman was planting at the other end, and basically. The dogs were, as he says, the dogs were squirrely all day. He'd pause between his conversation with these, puffs of a cigarette, and then he was suddenly dogs went crazy, and he looks up, and then he looks down at the land. There's Everest hunched over planting, and on one side of Everest, a grizzly bear pops out. On the other side of Everest is two cubs, but she doesn't realize because her head's down, she's planting, she can't hear anything, and so the dogs just beeline it at this bear full speed. But before they can get there, the grizzly hits Everest, knocks her like 15 feet. She goes for a tumble.
Oh my God.
And then the dogs run in there. They run interference. And so Roman drops his bags, runs back to the cache, gets that shotgun, runs back to the plot of land. The dogs are still all over the bear. The bear's kind of swinging at the dogs. And then he lets off this big kind of shotgun blast. And then his money kind of line for the story every time he told it from that time onward was kind of like, and then I had that bear, and you take this big kind of drag off a cigarette, undivided attention. And so the bear then turned itself towards Roman and started running at him. He basically shot at the bear, clipped it. The bear stands up. He quickly reloaded. The shotgun was like a break action, put a couple more slugs in there, and he put a couple into its chest, and then it was kind of lying there, and then he slowly kind of went up, reloaded the gun, and coup de grace, finished off the bear. So in the end, like the aftermath of the story was that Everest, she'd gotten like 3 broken ribs and a broken wrist, so not too bad. The two bear cubs were actually given to like a wildlife sanctuary, so they were fine. And the Ministry of Natural Resources apparently came and they weighed the bear and said it was like 1,200 pounds, the biggest, female
biggest
grizzly
of all time.
they'd ever weighed. And so this is the first time I'm meeting this guy. He had this presence.
Well, it's quite the story, though.
He told this story, and it was like this amazing kind of story. And then as we're going along in this journey, when you're doing this cross-Canada canoe trip, you run into people. And kind of as an icebreaker, I would just encourage Roman, you should tell your bear story. And all the way across, we had lunch with Pierre Trudeau. He told Pierre Trudeau the story. We had lunch with just people in small towns, and people always enraptured and captured as he kind of laid out the tale. I knew every kind of bump in line. And then, but then we kind of, I guess about 3 months into a 6-month canoe trip, it kind of soured. There was just some disagreements, and kind of we just weren't compatible in the end. I mean, in a long time, 171 days in the canoe, things happened, but we never really saw, eye to eye that way. But then about 6 months after the canoe ended, we successfully did this canoe trip. We didn't really, talk much after that, but then I was at this pub just down the hill from me in Deep Cove in North Vancouver, and I was having a drink with my friend Kevin Rehill, who was a patroller up at Cypress, the local ski mountain here. And he brought along a friend, and it was another fellow patroller, and her name was Everest. Beautiful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl named Everest. And I said, this can't be a coincidence.
That's a unique name, right?
It's a unique name, unique description. She fits everything. And then I said, just to make sure, I said, did you ever plant up in Swan Hills, Alberta? She said, yeah, tree planted there. You ever know a guy named, Roman Rockcliffe? And she said, she kind of had to stop for a second and look in the air, and she said, oh, yeah, I know Roman. He was in our camp with us. And I said, and I kind of said, well, how are you? How'd you recover from the injuries and the bear attack? And she goes, bear attack?
Oh my gosh.
And so I told her that whole story I just told you, and then she kind of had to think a couple of. She said, that's just crazy.
She would remember, right?
Yeah, I said, that's just crazy. I said, see, I knew Roman, but we didn't really talk. We weren't really friends. I did plant with another guy, and we planted the same piece of land, and we'd coordinate and work together, but I never worked with Roman personally. She said the only bear incident at the entire camp that year was that one bear came onto their plot of land. They both went together to go get the shotgun and come back. By the time they got back, the bear was gone. So of course they came back to the camp with this bear story, but Roman had somehow concocted this kind of hero fantasy story that was almost became his seminal story for making an impression.
And is that how he basically got on the trip with you? Was this story so pivotal to you being like, well, if he can take
for me it was more bear. He was organizing this cross-Canada canoe trip, and I would do anything to do, so I didn't care. It didn't matter whether he told me that story or not. I would have gone on the canoe trip with him. Right. But then it made me reflect on all these other stories he told to me along the way, was any of it ever true? You reflect on these things he was saying about his life, and he was such a bit of a used car salesman that I just did not know what he told me was true. So kind of really, and made me reflect in a bit of a positive way. It's kind of so you had this kind of life where he had to kind of make up this story to make himself bigger than he was, and I basically thought this canoe trip, which we actually did, he was actually replacing this kind of false life story with a real life story that's actually a better story.
That's
in terms
interesting.
Of going across Canada. So he was kind of probably searching. These kind of. I'm sure if you're telling this story that isn't true over and over again, there's got to be something gnawing away at your soul a little bit.
Yeah.
So this canoe trip probably maybe soothed that, and he could replace that bear story with, hey, I canoed across Canada.
Therapy, an outdoor therapy. I mean,
outdoor
really.
Therapy.
Once you canoed across Canada, you're going to have stories to tell, right?
Exactly.
I mean, you don't need to shoot a grizzly bear after that. So that's an interesting take. Maybe, he was looking for something.
After that with Roman, because we didn't get along so well, he was a canoeist, but I didn't necessarily I didn't look for people who were necessarily good canoeists. I just looked for people who were more compatible. And living on the West Coast, there's a lot of climbers and mountaineers and skiers, and they're used to having difficult times in the outdoors. They can deal with situations, and as long as you're comfortable in this kind of wilderness setting for weeks on end, that's the main thing. You can teach them the basics. You can teach them the basics of paddling and canoeing as you go along. So it's kind of more that interpersonal comfort and ease, where there's not always this kind of literally the last 3 months of that canoe trip, Roman and I, we didn't talk to each other. I was in the front, he was in the back. It was just quietly paddling.
That's weird.
Yeah, exactly. So we were just bound by the mission at that point, so we kept going, but it wasn't something that and I still enjoyed the newness and enjoyed the surroundings around me, but I'd like to have that more of an interpersonal kind of rapport and connection with my partner. So definitely look for people that are you get along with, but be real comfortable in there, but also are pretty generally laid back and not not so, I guess, just kind of more in line with the way I am. So then, so since then, I started looking for people that way. But like people have, like one friend of mine, Taku, we did 2 long canoe trips, but now he's got 3 kids and he's got a different life. So people, life changes for people.
Fit into taking off for 30 days,
exactly.
which is perfect for Ryan, as it would.
Exactly. So Ryan doesn't have any kids, and he's a bit more, has a bit more of a flexible lifestyle, does more contracts. He works in northern BC doing avalanche control and assessment. So he was a good partner for that. So so Ryan, at first glance, I didn't know him that well too. You kind of get to know people. It's kind of the adventure of going on these journeys. You learn about the landscape, but also in some ways you learn even more intimately about these people you travel with. So if you have that basic compatibility, then you never know where it's going to go from there. So that's part of the interpersonal adventure along with the actual physical adventure at the same time.
Yeah,
and it makes for a good story. It's not always the same person, right?
Totally, yeah. I mean, and I guess it's one of those things that you can teach the paddle strokes, but if there is an interpersonal problem, there's probably not a lot of ways out of that. Yeah,
then you're just not enjoying it. There's always something clawing at the back of your head. And with Pearson, you mentioned Pearson, the musician. We had a great journey a couple of years earlier. It was like a 750-kilometer canoe trip, but it was through kind of cottage country.
Right.
And we were actually touring his album. So
stakes weren't quite as high then.
Yeah,
right?
much more relaxed. Yeah. You're taking a day off here and there. You're stopping at a lodge somewhere to do a concert or a rafting company on the Ottawa River or at just someone's cabin. And so it was more about the music than the maybe the remoteness of the journey and the need to put in the miles so you don't run out of food kind of thing. You're gonna hit a town every couple of days to resupply. You didn't have to have it all carried
less
with
stress.
You kind of thing. Exactly. So there was less whereas you took Pearson from a that kind of a more relaxed kind of concert touring lifestyle into like a proper canoe trip. Then it was kind of like it was just a little bit more than probably he thought it would be, I guess. Because I was very relaxed because that's what that required for that trip. But then I turned on Mr. Hard Tripper mode on him, which is kind of a little bit unfair to Pearson. Exactly. And so, and I learned afterwards that he did have some problems with his hands. Like he basically had a bit of...
that's mentioned in the story. And this is a story you wrote for Explorer a couple years ago, just to give some context.
Yeah, it was for the was it spring 2018 maybe?
Oh yeah, maybe it was just last year. Time flies.
Just last year, but about a year ago it came out. So Keeping Time, I think it was called.
Yes.
You buy it digitally. So then for him, I guess he had it taught him a little bit, but he also didn't tell me the extent of his hand injuries, and even like after that article was written, he had problems up to a year.
Oh wow!
I thought he'd recovered. He didn't mention it, but then
for a musician, that's
and his hands are his life for his playing, but I'd never heard of anyone losing feeling in their hands, which he lost about 3 days in. And but a lot of it's basically, it's not because the paddling necessarily exacerbated it, but he'd been playing cello really hard, producing a couple of albums in Europe, and his fingers were already stressed out, I think, and then the paddling just kind of put it over the edge. Right. So, but I think he's back at it now. About a year of physio. Tendinitis is basically what he had, his kind of or carpal tunnel tendinitis combo. So he's kind of hopefully gotten it over now. So.
Back to Ryan and your trip last year. You've already talked about how Ryan fit in so well in terms of having the time. He's adaptable. He's used to being in the outdoors. But you also mentioned a little bit about how you were a bit aghast at some of his personal behavior. And I wanted to touch on that and also talk about the theme of the article that you wrote and the singularity.
The singularity, I'd read an article about Ray Kurzweil years ago, kind of encapsulating his whole theory. I think it was in Rolling Stone, and how he basically envisioned this time in the future when basically humans will be fully merged with technology. Basically, like little nanobots would be in your bloodstream, kind of fixing and correcting and keeping you alive for like 300 years as we kind of completely, technology will create this kind of utopian world where no one will ever die.
But it's not a utopia to you, is it?
No, exactly, because it's kind of just got a lot of problems. I mean, I think I look, the singularity was here is my perspective in the sense that Kurzweil is looking to this future of singularity, and really I look at in terms of what we've kind of lost through technology. There's more of a singularity of man and nature and being comfortable in the wilderness. A lot of First Nations, they used to, they could look at a forest and it would be like, a bounty of, it would be the trees, and the animals would be their food, their clothing, their shelter, their fuel, and they knew how to get it and acquire it. It wasn't an easy way to live, but they weren't dependent on anything else except for their skill and knowledge, which
being totally in tune to nature as a form of the singularity versus the future singularity being totally out of tune with it and only in tune with a completely artificial way of being, I suppose.
Exactly,
right?
yeah. So you're kind of instead of like, a million years of evolution getting us to the point where we can kind of survive and exist off of what the earth provides, now you're kind of almost separated from that completely. All those skills are lost, and you're completely dependent on, say, devices and robots and technology, and if that's taken away, then it's like, you're helpless.
And Ryan was almost halfway there in a way. He could he's experiencing the outdoors, he had the mindset, seemed like a great guy. But what was he doing that had you aghast on the trip?
Yeah, like in terms of like the one thing I never had anyone watching, you kind of go on these trips for 6 weeks or whatever to kind of separate from this kind of addiction to your phone and thing. But he brought that phone addiction right along with on trip. So he'd watch YouTube videos at night. Even one day he listened to like
were you sharing a tent, or do you have your own tent?
We were sharing a tent. Yeah, I mean he did use earphones. It wasn't like listening to the. I remember him like just laughing and giddily showing me this Migos video in the middle of the journey. It's like, I don't want to be seeing the Migos right now, man. I just want
You'll catch up when you get home, eh?
I just want to read, I was reading The Orenda by Joseph Boyden, which is kind of more like a throwback kind of book, and I was totally into that.
But here's what I thought was interesting in the article, and as you're saying that now, that, I mean, you are essentially talking about like hot media versus cool media. I mean, you're engaged in a book, and he's watching YouTube videos. And now, how old is Ryan?
He is 35, so 35. He counts as a millennial.
Yeah. And so, is that just a generational thing?
Yeah.
What's the difference? Can you explain
I think it is. I think also a friend of mine who we stayed with, Eric McNair Landry, who's a well-known explorer. We base camped out of his place. We basically left from his house to start our trip, and he was like he reads a lot, and he was saying that when you're reading, actually physically reading, not just getting fed flashing images, you're actually your mind is engaged, and it's actually taking in the information more than you would off of. So I think there's something to kind of mentally engaging and actually visually, reading, and your mind is actually reading the words, and there's more of a mind, body connection to that. And
I would tend to agree.
Yeah, and I think something that's more almost like something that is. It's just more tactile, holding a physical book, or even a Kindle for that matter. But it's just more tactile. You're involved in it more, and I think it is definitely old technology versus new. But it's
and you're not so laser focused either, especially particular with the earphones and everything like that.
Yeah. All
your senses are now focused on a screen, whereas with the book you can be more engaged with your surroundings. The river's still flowing by when you're reading a book, whereas if you have earphones on, and I thought that was interesting because I know. I'm 40, which puts me in a weird gap between generations. So I sometimes
you're kind of between me and Ryan.
Yeah, exactly. And so I talk to like my wife is a millennial technically, just on the end. And so I know millennials, and I know people who are older and stuff. And you'll talk to someone who thinks, an app and a book are the same thing. It's like, I can just get that information on my app. Go 10 years older than that, and they're just like, no, that is not the same thing at all. That is garbage, and the book is what's good. And it was very interesting to see how you viewed that. And I think, as I can steal from both generations, I was siding on your side. I was like, oh my god, that'd be YouTube videos in the barren grounds in a tent. This is sacrilegious.
Or somebody else will read the article and they'll say, I'm on Ryan's side.
What's the big deal?
What's with this old guy shouting at me from his lawn, right?
That's what I'm kind of doing. Yes, which was funny because my proofreader for the magazine, I give him the proofs. His name is Sam, and he is 30.
Right.
And he actually made a sarcastic comment in the like he really enjoyed the article, just FYI. But he made like just a funny comment.
It's meant to provoke.
Yeah, totally.
Of course.
Where you talked about like, I can't believe he's watching YouTube videos, as we're saying now.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you're wearing Gore-Tex. You've got dry bags. You've got you make mention of pepperoni. I mean, this is modern technology as well. So what is the line? Is it really just the flashing screen that you had the problem with then?
No, I think the line is more, so when I'm out there, I'm still I'm still paddling a canoe. I'm still, waist deep in the rapids, still negotiating wild terrain. And I do have a camera. I take, obviously, there's pictures of animals and that sort of thing. But I think you're also you're still completely in tune with what's around you. So I think the line is crossed when, for example, there was one day where Ryan decided he would just listen to a podcast all day during. So if you're listening to a podcast while you're paddling, you're not present, and you're basically cutting yourself off from where you are. So I think once you get to the point where technology is limiting your experience in the outdoors, if it's taking away from...
If it's putting a wall between you, maybe. Whereas like Gore-Tex is actually going to help you spend more time out in the outdoors.
Yeah.
Even if it is a brand, it's been around since the 70s or whatever, but, a new modern technology. Whereas if you could think of the Inuit as 4,000 years ago, they had their version of it. They used like seal intestines and stuff like that.
I think it's more when you give up your own mind to technology in a way. So be it through, nanobots, or be it through, listen to a podcast instead of, being in the environment around you. I think it's almost like it's escapism. If you're trying to get away from where you are, should you be in that spot? So and I think if people are in the wilderness and you're kind of comfortable in the wilderness, and you can kind of use, like when I'm on these trips, I do kind of try to follow some of the indigenous kind of uses. I'll always make like tea out of like spruce tips and like Labrador tea and say rose hip, tamarack in the evening. You kind of use what's allowed. You're still cooking over a fire, which is that's like something hardwired
into. You cooked over the fire most times, not a stove. Then,
probably just bring a stove just in case. It's really hard, especially as you get deep into the barren grounds. It's really hard to collect enough wood to actually get a boil going. It's a lot more work and time. And if it's rainy and wet, then it's like double hard. So we basically cook whenever we could by fire because we're limited. We just used the fuel when we needed to, and then otherwise cook by fire when we could. So in the Boreal, up until you get a little bit past the Pikes Portage, it's quite easy, and after that, it's kind of you're hunting a little bit more for wood. But I did see also in that trip, I think if someone spends enough time, Ryan is so locked into technology in his day-to-day life, but I think I mentioned in the article also towards the end he was kind of starting to put away the phone, not watching videos. He started reading a book I brought along.
And did this happen organically, or did it happen because you needled him?
No, I didn't. It just kind of started happening, and then he started fishing more and cooking over the fire. He's a very good cook, and so I think once you spend, it's almost like what you get, because his job requires him. He's an avalanche analyst. He'll listen to avalanche, the latest scientific technology, and he's looking at it on maps and aerial stuff, and then he communicates everything through his phone. And his work comes through that, and then so I think it's just you're so immersed in that life. It probably takes about 3 or 4 weeks of being in a wilderness setting away from that.
For him. What's the big deal, right?
Until
YouTube
you start
videos.
to think, I'm kind of, this is more interesting than this phone. This kind of herd of caribou is more interesting. This kind of wolf that walked into our camp. All these sorts of things.
It's cool that it happened without you grabbing his phone and tossing it in the river either.
No,
right?
I would never do that. So I kind of accept what people are, and it doesn't affect me. He's not forcing me to watch Migos video the whole time.
But it affects you a little bit,
right?
It
does. In terms of I do like to have like a symbiosis with a partner. So, like for example, someone like Taku, he was this very in tune and enjoying every moment. Opening my eyes up to wonders that I don't even see in nature. A couple of partners have been like that, where they actually add a lot to your experience. They kind of point out things that. You think you know everything, but you don't, because another partner comes in from a different perspective and will show you things about, nature just through the curiosity that you would never think of or look at. So there's been a few partners like that too, that kind of bring that up. And I'm definitely more in the Luddite category. But then I come back here. You do write articles, and I've edited films, and I've shot films, and it's all digital and technology.
Right now.
Podcasting, but I think podcasting in a way, it's almost a bit more throwback. It's not, you're not looking at a flick. You actually have to use your head if you're going to pay attention to a podcast. It's like a conversation. It's almost a little bit more like the 1950s when people would sit around the family around the radio and listen to, these kind of old serials and stuff that would come up.
Which I think something is lost by not having that. I think
exactly, and I think people are now. It's almost people are going back because I think people suddenly think, oh, I actually really enjoyed And then it forces by listening to something, it actually gets your mind to create the pictures. Just like reading something gets your mind to create the picture, and it's more than having just something thrown at you like something video-like. So
where you can just tune out and have it all served to you, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Now, there was one thing that Ryan wanted to bring on the trip that you would have no part of, and that was toilet paper.
Basically, toilet paper is kind of, it's bulky, and it takes up room in your pack. And the thing I hate most, if you don't dispose of toilet paper properly, and I've come across campsites in more popular areas where you see kind of maybe half burnt toilet paper used kind of just tossed back in the woods, and you have this kind of, and it just sticks up. It's bright white against that kind of green and brown background in a campsite, and it's kind of like reminds me of just trash and garbage as well.
That's interesting, yeah.
But also, because there are such better substitutes out there,
you mentioned stones, which I thought was...
Yeah, like pebble stones. yeah. So it's often like toilet paper if you're like thinking of using it, like the ideal is, say, something like a nice sphagnum moss. And sphagnum moss, like indigenous people, it was like a key part. It actually has antiseptic properties. So sphagnum, and so they would actually wrap newborns in the sphagnum moss, not knowing that it was antiseptic, but now they've actually tested. So if you have a cut or something and you rub sphagnum on it, it'll actually clean it effectively with a bit of a natural antiseptic. So using that as toilet paper is ideal. It's soft, and it'll just kind of break up into the environment. You don't notice you've used it.
That traditional knowledge is always so fascinating to me, because you look at that and think, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, whatever, the Inuit people or the traditional people of the land, whoever they were, didn't, quote unquote, didn't know it was antibacterial. But over time, they knew something was good about it. They didn't have the modern terminologies that we have to figure out the germ concept of disease or whatever. But I just love the way it's like, no, they knew. They just didn't have... they didn't have a microscope that they could look at the and I just always find that so fascinating.
It's like generations of trial and error, and eventually, some people.
This is the stuff that works.
Yeah, if you eat the bad mushroom, that Jimmy died. But if he eats a good mushroom, well, it's actually really good. Yeah, exactly. So don't eat that one. Eat this one. Or
takes a long time.
Don't wrap the baby in
poison ivy,
in like birch bark, because they're going to get a rash. But wrap them in the sphagnum moss, because they sleep quietly in this like soft moss. But so I mean. But anyway, you do kind of. I just kind of like to use, even when I do like skiing trips, I'll just kind of use the snow, and so whatever works. So that's kind of, it's cold, but it works.
I mean, I suppose one less thing to pack. It doesn't weigh much, but when you think 30 days. And you want to take enough, I mean, that's kind of a pain. That might be one more trip back to the canoe on a portage, right?
And you think about, the toilet, I guess Thomas Crapper invented it probably in the 1800s. That's probably how long toilet paper's been around. It's a technology, and it's...
relatively modern.
Mid-1800s, so it hasn't been around that long, and it's... with modern sewage, of course, it makes sense. I don't use sphagnum moss at my home in North Vancouver.
You'd be called a plumber a lot.
Exactly. It would jam it right up. So
and so when Ryan
it fits in this, again, it's one of these things that fits in the city but doesn't fit in the country.
That's cool. Yeah. And Ryan did eventually give in, and you guys burnt the toilet paper. And how did Ryan? Was that happy moment for him? Was he?
Well, he kind of was sheepish, and like because I remember we were kind of packing at Eric's place in Yellowknife, and Ryan says just like, hey, I got the toilet paper, and I just kind of looked at him with this kind of, what's that for kind of thing, and he said, it's toilet paper.
Like, what do you mean what it's for? Do I have to explain this to you, Frank?
Exactly. And I said, no, man, we don't need toilet paper. There's moss, there's like smooth pebble stones,
And what did Eric think? About that theory? Was he nodding along with you?
Well, Eric wasn't in the room with us at the time. So we didn't get into the toilet paper discussion with Eric. But I'm sure Eric probably, I don't know if he'd pack toilet paper, because he's done some
for everyone who's listening,
trip.
Eric McNair Landry is a very experienced Arctic expeditioner and instructor. And
him and his sister, they have done amazing trips. They kite skied the entire Northwest Passage.
They've been in Explore several times, and their stories are incredible.
He did like a kayaking and hiking traverse of southern Baffin Island in kind of Inuit style kayaks he actually made. He's a bit of a genius. Like he's the kind of guy who he has an engineer's approach to expedition. So you look at him in a room full of adventurers and expedition guys. The last guy you think is the hardest core of them all would be Eric. He's like this kind of bespectacled, slim, super nice, smiley, kind of skinny guy. But he's like the hard man of the entire room. Wow. But he's so low key about it. He's more of a shower.
That's often the case. I mean,
he's a shower, not a talker.
Exactly.
So
that's neat. So one thing I thought too. when we talk about the YouTube videos that you didn't approve of, but, allowed to solve itself naturally, and maybe the toilet paper that I believe in the story, it was right before a 2-day portage.
That's right, Pike's Portage.
Portage, that he was thinking, you know what, I'm going to go Frank's way because I can't even, not 1 gram more is going to be my backpack.
Exactly, Ryan, you'll be carrying the toilet paper.
But now you've been doing trips like this for, like you said, for over 20 years. It's going on at least 20 since the mid-90s.
23, 24 years.
Yeah. And now when you make these suggestions to people about, or you don't approve of their YouTube watching or the toilet paper, is it, Frank, I'm the experienced one, or is it kind of like Frank's way or the highway, a little bit of an alpha dog?
No, I mean, I'm similar way. I will kind of suggest to people, I'll say, hey, this is what I do, and I tend to lead by example. If they don't want to follow that example and keep doing it their way, I mean, that's up to them, but I won't say, hey, put that away, hey, don't do that, don't do this. I'm more like, I'll tell them how I do it, and I'll show them how it works based on my experience. This is the best way to do this is the best way to do that. I have lots of trial and error. It's kind of like that generations, eating the wrong mushroom, eating the right mushroom. But and eventually it just takes a little while. You gotta kind of plant the seed and let it grow.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes
in 30 days you have time for that to happen.
Yeah, and then like I said, towards the end, whether Ryan will say he probably doesn't realize he even did it, and it wasn't something conscious necessarily in his part, but he did kind of start to become much more kind of one with his surroundings rather than escaping into podcasts and YouTube videos and stuff like that.
And I think that is just, I think that is hardwired into humanity. I mean, you take anyone, you take a kid, a 6-year-old kid who plays on the iPad all day, or someone, my age, your age, older, well, we're roughly the same age, but even older and older and older, who's used to technology and used to modern comforts. You take them on a camping trip, and the first night they might want to watch Netflix in the tent. You leave them out there long enough, and I've never seen it not go away. You know what I mean? Every time, all of a sudden, the stars are more interesting than Netflix or something like that. And it is a fascinating thing that it's almost, I don't know if there's any science behind it, but it is this hardwired bit of humanity that we are, if given the opportunity, I think we will connect to nature.
I'm going to leave part 1 there. It seems like a good note to send you off with. Maybe consider your own reliance on technology and the benefits of reconnecting with nature as you disconnect with your phone. After you meditate on this, click episode 2. We're going to continue our conversation with Frank and delve into what he's learned from the people of the land, as well as how you too can step into this world and plan your own epic trip. Spoiler, it's easier than you think. Thanks for listening. I'm David Webb.